I declare the agenda briefing forum of the 18th of June 2024 held in Council Chambers at Level 2, 388 Hay Street. Open at 5:33 p.m. Welcome staff and councillors. On behalf of the City of Subiaco, I acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I recognise their ongoing connection to the land and waterways of Subiaco. Okay, this evening we've got a few councillors absent, either on leave or with apologies. We've got Councillor Jones and Councillor Burns on approved leave. I've received an apology from Councillor De Vries, and the remaining 5 councillors are here in person, and I would make that 6 elected members in total. We've got the executive leadership team here in person, and we'll announce any further staff members as and when needed this evening. Okay, are there any disclosures of interest this evening? I understand we'll have at least 2. Councillor O'Connor.
Yes, through you, Mayor McMullen. I have a proximity interest in relation to item C2 on the draft Central Subiaco Parking Precinct Plan, because I live in that area under consideration.
Thank you. Councillor White.
Yes, as above. Same with me. Thank you.
Okay.
Do I give this to someone?
Thank you. If we get that in writing from the 2 of you, we'll have that on file for next week as well. No further disclosures for anyone else? Okay, there's no approved deputations and no announcements from me this evening. We'll move on to the officer reports. Beginning with C1, 9 Sadlier Street, Subiaco. Any questions on C1, councillors? Councillor Powell.
Look, just a couple of brief questions.
Oh, sorry, it's me.
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mayor. Just a couple of brief questions. Were there any objections received to this proposal? And is it principally coming to the council because it's in a heritage area?
Director of Development Services.
Thank you. No submissions received, and yes, because it is within a heritage area.
I noticed that there are a couple of compliance issues, but would they be regarded as significant?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. No, the matters for the design principle assessment are fairly minor and contextual, and they are appropriate for the streetscape.
Councillor White.
Yeah, just a clarification, I guess partly because it comes from our previous discussions about other topics, but in the staff report, it says, while the building is a heritage protected place, it's identified as having no contribution to the heritage area and is of no individual heritage significance. Can you explain that to me?
Manager Planning Services.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So under the planning and development local planning schemes regulations, if a property is on a heritage list or in a heritage area, it's considered or defined as a heritage protected place. That doesn't necessarily mean it's of any heritage value or significance. This particular building, the original dwelling that stood there was demolished in, I think it was 1975. So the building that exists there at the moment is of no heritage significance, and demolition can be supported.
Any other questions on C1? Okay, we'll move on to C2, the draft Central Subiaco Parking Precinct Plan, out for consultation. Councillor O'Connor and Councillor White will ask you to leave for this item. Don't go too far though. Any questions on C2? Councillor Johnston.
Yes, thank you, through you, Mayor. I was wondering, in some sections it refers to control, like 1P control. In other areas it just refers to, say, 1P. What does control mean? And what's the difference between 1P control versus 1P, for example?
Okay, we'll put that straight through to the Manager, Health and Compliance Services. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, and through you. So control refers to parking control, like a parking restriction, and control, 1P control and 1P are the same. So it refers to a 1 hour time restriction.
Further question?
Yeah, actually, thank you, because I did send an email with a few questions relating to parking, so I'll go through them all. Do you want me to read them all out in a row, or shall I? Is Duke Street between Rockaby and the cul-de-sac the only area having paid parking newly installed?
I assume Mr. Rogers will be best placed to answer all of these.
Yes, and he has got the questions ahead of time. So
Oh, good.
if you want to read them all out, he'll be able to respond to all of them.
Okay.
Okay, let's do that, Councillor Johnston.
Okay.
Read all your questions and then we'll get an answer on each of them.
What distance and how many parking spaces would that equate to that will effectively be removed on the northern side of Lawler Street between Railway Road and Federal Street? And the consultation process, will that be published in the local Post newspaper and social media platforms directing people to the Have You Say website? And I noticed that it says 3 hour paid parking on Bagot Road on the southern side along Theatre Gardens, yet the rest of that street to Railway Road is 30-minute parking. Why is that section of Bagot Road not in line with the other two blocks where it's only half an hour? Thank you.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, and through you. So with Duke Street, that is the only section that we're proposing to turn into paid parking, and that's a result of the mixed commercial use that's got to be occurring there. So we were looking to install paid parking there simply because it's going to allow a better use of that parking resource for everything that's intended there for residents and visitors and businesses alike. In terms of Lawler Street, the distance is about 60 metres and it's about 11 bays, and that's just simply to kind of, the street is actually too narrow to support parking on both sides. To reflect that, back in April we got a email from Daglish Fire Department, who were trying to attend a fire on that street, on that section of the street, and they made the observation that they couldn't actually get their fire trucks through there because of that parking situation. By removing parking on that side of the street though, verge parking still remains available for residents there, and that's actually what's being largely used as well. So it's just really kind of, I guess, putting into practice what is already being done. In terms of the consultation process, I noticed we published in the Post through the Subi scene, and it will also be published via our social media as well as the website as well as direct consultation as well. The 3 hour paid parking, from Hensman Road through to Railway Road, that carries a largely 30-minute restriction because it's directly adjacent to King Edward Memorial Hospital. And the idea for that is essentially to have it as pick up and drop down sort of thing. So people who are just quickly going into the hospital and quickly leaving.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. I guess I'm really wondering about the 3 hour paid parking section, because that's, I think that's on the northern side, it's on Bagot Road, on the southern side, sorry, of Bagot Road, just in front of Theatre Gardens. So I understand why the 30 minutes in place for the hospital, but then it jumps to 3 hours. So it's quite a big difference. And I think there's a lot of parking pressure. I know that we've had a resident recently relatively recently talking about issues of parking along Bagot Road. So I just wonder if that might be up for consideration to reduce that from 3 hours.
Thank you, through you. So a couple of things. That area of parking has traditionally been all-day parking, and it's only just changed to 3-hour paid parking as part of the town centre parking precinct plan. Our observations in the field now is that since we've actually made that change, parking is actually available in that section for the first time ever. So we're actually quite happy to see that. As part of the central parking precinct plan consultation, however, people can actually make recommendations to that. So if they do want to actually see a change in that parking, then they can actually make that through that consultation process. But as I said, at the moment, it's a fairly new restriction that's in place, and it's actually successful.
Thank you.
Any other questions on C2? Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mayor. I noticed that one of the suggestions, it's northern side of Bagot Road near the intersection with Railway Road, 30 minutes from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m, Monday to Sunday. Now, every other one is a Saturday cut-off. I'm wondering why that one's a Sunday.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, and through you. The Sunday restriction exists a little bit around the hospital simply because that parking pressure is always present. The hospital is always open, it's always in demand, so that restriction exists simply to deal with any parking pressure if it occurs on the weekends.
Thank you, and one more. This is the northern side of Lawler Street between Railway Road and Federal Street. The street is too narrow to support parking on both sides. This extends the restriction already present on Lawler Street up to this section. How many properties will that affect? Or how many ratepayers might lose their parking out of that?
Thank you, and through you. So it's estimated we'll lose about 11 parking bays. But as I said before, that parking is actually that unavailability of parking, or that, I guess, that risk of parking on both sides, is actually seems to be recognised by the residents themselves. And as such, they're actually changing their parking. So they're actually parking largely on the verge anyhow. So I would suggest, I'm not entirely too certain how many properties will be directly affected by it, but around the number of 11 or 12. And as I said, it's around it's about a 60-metre stretch. But again, as part of the consultation, they'll all be asked about, how this affects them and what their ideas are with that.
Look, I suppose that's the point. You will be getting feedback on that about whether people are happy with that. So, yeah, thank you.
Any other questions on C2? Okay, we'll get Councillor O'Connor and Councillor White back in, and then we'll make our way on to C3. Okay, we'll move on to C3. Western Central Local Emergency Management Arrangements. Any questions on C3, councillors? Councillor Powell.
Yes, I'm getting quite regular at this. Look, there's only one question, and that's in the risk and asset implications. It says, by adopting the arrangements, the City and Park will be managing risks associated with emergencies in the district and leveraging the assets and resources of other neighbouring local governments to assist if required. I'm just wondering why that's there. I mean, what is the risk implication? Why is that qualification necessary?
Director Technical Services.
Yep, thank you, and for you, Presiding Member. So, and Chris might want to chime in after I've said my piece. So, really, that risk pertains to if we weren't to endorse this arrangements along with all the other members as part of the WCLEMC, which is a bit of a mouthful. And really, that's if we went to agree with, endorse this current agreement, there is a risk that we might not be party to this group, which obviously has 8 other local governments, and obviously their resources that can be used in the event of an emergency of some kind. So effectively, if these arrangements aren't endorsed, there is always a risk that potentially the rest of the group goes on with the group with these arrangements without the city, and the city effectively would have to have its own arrangements in place, but not be able to leverage the resources of other surrounding local governments that are currently in this group. Hopefully that makes things a bit clearer.
So the risk is not belonging to it. I thought, my understanding was the risk was belonging, had something to do with belonging to it, but it's not belonging to it.
So just to be clear, so the risks are the same. You obviously minimise it if you do endorse and you are party to the arrangements with the group. Is that clear?
Any other questions on C3? Okay, we'll move on to C4, the tender for supply and delivery of waste trucks. There's 4 tenders that we're being asked to consider. Any questions on C4, councillors? Councillor O'Connor.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. Just a general question about the noise from the trucks. Is there any consideration given through the tender process to the noise from our rubbish trucks?
Director of Technical Services.
Thank you. Yes, that is, as you can probably imagine, given the operating times of our waste trucks, that is one of the considerations. And through the specifications, we do ask for a number of noise levels to be given. So that was part of the assessment that was undertaken by the panel.
Okay, well, I heard that. Look, I think for everyone's benefit, what was that? What was the noise you can't emit? Director of Technical Services.
Yep. So just for the benefit, what the CEOs was mentioning, which is quite right. One of the noise that we cannot remove is the reverse alarm for a reversing truck. That's just required as per Australian design requirements.
Any other questions on C4? All right, C5, another tender for the provision of sweeping services. Questions on C5? Councillor Johnston.
Yeah, look, I just noted that the tender went out on the 20th of March and closed on the 18th of April, and the existing contract at the time was expiring on the 2nd of May. Is it usual that contracts would expire before we've gone through the whole process?
Director of Technical Services.
So for you, Presiding Member, so no, it's not ideal and typical. This one's, I guess, somewhat unique, but the benefit is, and why the executive's been comfortable that when this report's gone up, is we do have a holding over period with our current provider or our previous provider, but you're quite right, typically we'd tender well before the expiration of a service tender like this.
Councillor O'Connor.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. Another noise-related question. Just in relation to this is a services contract, what are the times in which these types of sweeping activities can occur?
Director of Technical Services.
For you, Presiding Member, so typically most of these are done after 7 a.m, with probably the only exception of around the CBD where we operate earlier. So as per our current noise management plan, there's a number of roads around the CBD predominantly, so Rockaby, Hay Street, where waste collection and also sweeping and other related cleaning services are exempted, so allowed outside of the 7 to 7, typically on a Monday to Saturday.
what does outside of 7 to 7 actually look like in practice?
Thank you. Typically, it would be the morning prior to 7, so normally 6 to 7, usually. Yes, and so just to explain the reasoning behind that, it is covered in the noise management plan, but predominantly it's just around getting in when there's fewer vehicles parked, obviously to ensure the service operates well, and obviously given that to avoid the peak hour traffic to minimise impact on people in our busiest roads and busiest areas. So yeah.
Just one final follow-up, Mayor McMullen, through you. So residents, even in those inner city areas, shouldn't expect services like this to be occurring before 6?
So really, the noise management plan allows occurring before 7. There might be instances, depending on demand, there might be before 6. But typically, we appreciate that obviously there's a balance we have to strike between amenity for the area, but also what can be worked. So there may be instances where it occurs before 6, but that wouldn't be commonplace. If you want more specific information, I can certainly provide that for you.
Any other questions on C5? Okay, we'll move on to C6, the review of our register of delegations and authorisations for 2024 and 2025. I know there's been some questions by email. And Councillor Kosovich.
Thank you, Mayor, and through you. I have a number of questions which I'll go through, and the staff have been very kind to provide responses to those. And I'll just go through them carefully and wait for the response so that we can, people following at home can see what those responses were, if I may. How many unauthorised development applications are made to the city per annum?
So I think Director of Development Services will be best placed to answer most of the questions based on today's email. So Mr. Petrosky, I'll hand that over to you, please.
Oh, my apologies.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So per annum, we could receive anywhere from 10 to 20 applications for retrospective planning approval. And typically most of these are in response to planning and compliance investigations that have been undertaken.
Thank you. How would Council be confident that it could maintain effective oversight with this delegated prosecutorial function?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So in setting a planning scheme and a planning framework, there's a compliance aspect to that as well, and that's written into the planning legislation. So if compliance needs to be undertaken, if they're generally minor issues, and these would ordinarily be reported to council, and that can be through the EMI process. And any other larger issues, council and elected members can request workshops and briefings, and officers will endeavour to keep them involved and aware of what's occurring in these instances as well. So through that dissemination of information, through working together, council can keep an eye on the types of planning compliance matters which are occurring throughout any period.
Thank you. Under the Planning and Development Act 2005, how often would it be necessary for the CEO to issue a planning infringement notice, please?
So planning infringement notices, it really depends on the nature of the use that's occurring, and we would also urge caution on using planning infringement notices as well. So over the past few years, we haven't issued too many. I think we've only issued 2 over the past 6 years. Now, if you do issue a planning infringement notice, what it means is that someone can't be prosecuted on that same matter. So the use of a range of planning compliance, whether it's through prosecution or infringement notices, needs to be carefully considered. And much of that information was included in the responses to the questions you sent earlier today.
Thank you for that. I just don't quite understand why we couldn't delete the planning information notices from that part. You say here, and I'll help you out there, the current situation will operate as per Local Planning Policy 7.5. Should Council provide the CEO with delegation to issue planning infringement notices in isolation, but not an ability to prosecute, then all compliance matters that result in Council authorising prosecution may be compromised at the time the court considers the matter. I'm just not sure I follow that. Why not simply delete planning infringement notices only?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So what's actually occurred over time is that planning compliance has been undertaken through a local planning policy. Now, when you're undertaking decisions and for any compliance, normally that should be kept under the delegation and authorisations register. So the only difference that we are proposing through this register is to give the CEO and then officers the ability to prosecute. And now the main reason for that is because sometimes you need to prosecute quite quickly, and normally those things are confidential. Not that we've had any substantial issues in the past. However, from our learnings, it is good to be able to be flexible in that regard. So the current situation is that we do issue planning infringement notices. We do it under a local planning policy. The right mechanism to do it is under the delegations and authorisations to ensure that officers and the CEO are properly authorised to do that. That's why the PIN has been included. The infringement notice has been included in the delegation. So it's no change. It's just changing to where the authorisation lays rather than the local planning policy.
Thank you, Mr. Petrovsky. In terms of any significant planning compliance matters, such as Sanua, would that continue to be brought forward to Council for consideration? And how would we make it so? Could we specify a level of seriousness that needs to come to Council?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. You probably could specify, conditions on the delegations. However, the nature of planning compliance is that you actually don't know what you're dealing with until you're dealing with it. Sinua and likes have come to Council, and we will endeavour to take anything that we think is significant and requires Council involvement to Council in a process. This is really dealing with the day-to-day matters and instances where we need to be quite nimble and flexible.
Yes, thank you for that. I understand that answer, but I'm just a little concerned that something may slip under the radar. We may miss out seeing something at Council that we need to see.
Any other questions? Councillor White.
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose I'm just trying to understand what's broken that we need to fix. I take the points. Obviously, on the one point, where this is centralisation of everything into the ground, CEO. I'm joking, but the point being, we are, for the sake of speedy. I think in your reply to Councillor Kosovic's questions, it's very much about this will be more flexible and speedier in terms of making these decisions. But I think we have to balance that against the idea that there are issues that arise that might be best dealt with at Council. And what comes to my mind is a matter that I won't go into detail now, but it had to do with a Telstra phone booths, you might recall. And in the end, that was all dealt with a delegated authority, and yet I believe that could have been a useful discussion to have had in council. Now, that's just, I'm not trying to bring that into this discussion here, but I'm saying, on the one hand, yes, I see the value of flexibility and giving more authority to the CEO to deal with this. On the other hand, I'm not sure that's always balanced well by EMIBs and other kinds of mechanisms for information sharing, when it could simply be too late and I've got the authority, the decision's been made. And we've seen that before. So I want to know what's broken before we decide how to fix it.
Director of Development Services.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. I wouldn't say it's broken, but it's probably incorrect that planning prosecution and planning infringement notices are authorised to the manager of planning services through a local planning policy. So normally that would be under a register of delegations and authorisations, and it would be through the CEO. So much like we have other compliance things. So that's one aspect. All we are doing is moving that from a local planning policy. Well, we're not even moving it. We're leaving it in that policy, but we're actually doing it through our delegations and authorisations. So it's a governance thing. The other part is actually prosecution. So what we've learned is sometimes if you're going to be prosecuting and with a land use that might and development that might be occurring, it might be occurring for a certain time, and people can be pretty hard to pin down. So you might need to prosecute pretty quickly. And that could be for a trivial matter, it could be for a minor matter, or it could be for a larger matter. For larger scale matters, that would ordinarily be discussed with elected members either through the EMIB or through a workshop or through an email like we have. So for example, we had a vape store that was discussed through EMIBs and that one actually went away, so that was a good outcome. So it's really about being quite quick and flexible with the prosecution aspect. The other one with that you mentioned was about a signage application. So that wasn't planning compliance, that was actually a DA, and that had originally come to council a few years back, so that's why it didn't come back again. So really the two things that are broken, if you may, is that the authorisation actually should sit with all the other authorisations in our delegations register for good governance, and local planning policies probably not the right mechanism to have that, and then being able to prosecute if need be. That doesn't take away the need for officers and the CEO to liaise with elected members on complex matters that might need council attention.
Councillor White.
I suppose it's the last part. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's the last part, which I thought your answer to Councillor Kosovich on about the same question was like that would be difficult to incorporate into it, because if we are authorising, so for example, we've had a recent incident where we had to go behind closed doors to consider whether the CEO should take some steps of a legal manner. Would that not have happened under this new plan? And if we're giving authority, then what you're saying is it becomes up to the CEO to decide whether or not he wants to consult with us about such matters. Am I understanding this correct?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So it's not about deciding whether or not to consult with elected members. For a matter, you're likely to be consulting and informing elected members. It's whether or not prosecution needs to occur, and that really most of the times is a technical matter under the Planning Act and the planning law. So you should be reviewing that from a planning point of view, to say that this use is, or this development is consistent or inconsistent with either the scheme or the development approval provided, much like you might consider other matters in, I'm going to step on someone's shoes here, in parking. So if someone's parked here or not parked here, it's an assessment undertaken. It's not something that would ordinarily be considered by council. So I don't think it's a decision for the CEO officers to consult. We should be consulting and informing and engaging with elected members in any event. But the decision on whether something needs to be prosecuted or an infringement notice should be informed through that investigation assessment.
Councillor Kosovich.
Thank you, Mayor, and through you. Just to follow up, if I may, Mr Petrovski, I noticed in the last bit of advice that you gave me, and I appreciate it very much, you state that city officers are planning to review Local Planning Policy 7.5, planning compliance, later this year. My question is, aren't we getting ahead of ourselves doing this tonight? Shouldn't we wait to get that bit of work done first?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. That is a good question. We don't, given that the change to planning infringement notices, there's actually no change to that. It's just moving where it is. We don't feel that that's overstepping the policy. You could change to not have prosecution delegated to the CEO, but we consider that this was an outlier in any event when we considered other local governments, compliance authorisations to be able to do this. So we don't see this as as something that really needs to wait the policy review, but I guess it could.
I'll take the opportunity to ask one. It's in relation to change number 4 in the summary of changes table at page 24 of the agenda. It's about a change that we've been discussing in some detail already, the addition of the function of the CEO to issue infringement notices. It seems like the reason stated in the report's not actually correct. From what I've heard this evening, we're not increasing robustness and responsiveness. We're essentially formalising the flow of delegation from council down to the CEO and ultimately down to the manager of planning services, which has existed until now, but we've just left out the step of actually mentioning the CEO and the issuing of infringement notices anywhere in our register of delegations. Have I understood the answers to tonight's questions correctly? And if so, can we have that reflected in the report for next week, please?
Thank you for your questioning. Yes, we can have a look at that, and I'll take that one on notice.
Thanks. And the other questions in relation to the change directly above that, the function for the CEO to commence prosecution, which we've also been discussing at some length. Just so I've got this abundantly clear, is it the case that if we were to commence any planning prosecution at the moment, we would first need to get council authorisation to do so? Is that the current status quo?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So if we proceed on the basis that complex matters will still be brought to council, CEO, maybe you could walk us through what a complex matter would look like. Would it be legal complexity we're talking about, or community interest in a planning matter, or potential penalties, or something else? What would a complex planning matter or a complex planning prosecution look like?
I think it would have all those dimensions and more, potentially also related to possible legal costs and those sort of matters. So, but we don't tend to have too many of them. So maybe the director could also add, given the experience that he's had at Subiaco, a bit. I've only been here almost 3 years, but he's been here substantially longer.
Mr. Petrovski.
Yeah, thank you. I think what would ordinarily be considered is, are there actually substantial implications to either the community members or a direction of council, or any potential political ramifications that might come out of that? So the our current one is probably what's happening with Sonora, although that really is it's a building function as well, so it's not necessarily under the Planning Act. And if there is a compliance matter associated with something that's occurred from a council decision or a council approval, then that will be ordinarily something that we would look to be taken back to council as the original decision maker. So if there are significant ramifications that might result in, community involvement or political ramifications or reputational risks to the city, then those are some things that we would consider bringing back for a council decision.
Okay. If councillors needed a bit more certainty or comfort than what we're talking about tonight, it seems to me that it is possible to specify conditions of delegation and authorisations. I mean, that's the approach we're actually taking in some of the other items. So it seems to me that what we could do is specify conditions associated with this delegation of authority to commence planning prosecutions. Would that be a potential way forward as you see it, Mr. Petrosky?
Look, absolutely, and that's probably something if an elected member's got a question about, something that we can probably work on and provide some guidance in the next few days if that assists.
Okay, might take that one offline. Any other questions on the delegations? All right, we'll move on to C7 then, appointment of a member to the Audit and Risk Committee. Any questions on C7? Okay, C8, the annual budget. Any questions on C8 that we haven't aired in the number of workshops that we've had already, or even if you wanted to repeat questions, that would be okay too. Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Look, this is in relation to an email that came in late this afternoon, and it's in regard to the Derby Road traffic calming, and the email, I think, refers to the area between Onslow Road and Derby Road. The email is from a resident who's asking that, as the matter appears to be in the 24-25 budget, essentially, can the residents make statements at the council at next week's council meeting?
CEO.
Yeah, the budget's being adopted at next week's ordinary council meeting, so they'd be able to put in for a both a statement and if they had questions as well, they could ask questions. That needs to be in by, let's look at governance, Monday, 5 p.m.
Just for my own benefit, if it was in the in this year's budget and approved, why is it also coming up in the forthcoming budget?
Not everything can be completed in one financial year, and some things go over financial years. So what actually happens with those projects, usually it's relating to consultation, or it may be contracts, etc., that are yet to start. Or a good example would be the Forest Walk, where actually the businesses asked that project start later because that was a quieter time for when the project started. So each year there's a whole range of both capital and operating projects that are the timing doesn't quite fit with the financial year, or are delayed for particular purposes, and then those are carried. You'll quite often hear the word carried forward, and some of them will have additional budget because the scope may have changed as well. So it's quite ordinary because Local Government Act, we can only adopt a budget for 1 year. And so it's quite an ordinary process that projects go over multiple years, or for a particular reason need to be rebudgeted or carried forward in the following year.
If it's already been approved in the current budget, does that mean it's got to be approved again in the forthcoming budget, or what would happen if it wasn't?
Yeah, that's correct. If it wasn't approved, then we wouldn't be able to do the project. There would be instances where contracts would already be in play, so that would cause contractual matters if the budget wasn't to be included. But if the project hasn't been implemented, then that means if it wasn't approved in the budget in a particular year, then we wouldn't be able to deliver it.
I've just got a question about Derby Road as well. Does yours relate to that, or? Okay, I'll go after you then, Councillor White.
No, it was just, you talked about the rolling over of budgets. Was anything of last year's budget for that item spent in this financial year?
Thank you, and for you, Presiding Member. So I think there's only just been some design costs incurred on that to date. So the majority of the budget would still be unspent.
Okay, my question in relation to the Derby Road budget line item relates to this idea that we might have residents making statements and asking questions about the Derby Road black spot funded works. There's been a whole process that's been handled at officer level in relation to those works and that project. We're not approving details of that project at next week's meeting. So, CEO, what are the options in relation to that budget line item from a council approval perspective next week? Obviously, we can approve the line item as is. We could take it out of the budget entirely, or we could budget a smaller amount, or even a greater amount, I suppose, if we really wanted to. Is there any other option that council as a decision maker on C8 next week will have in front of it?
Yeah, if I could, through the chair. It's open for council to ask for some additional information to come back before a project proceeds, because if council adopt a budget, then the project proceeds. So an example of this was, I think, the last budget, might have been the one before, when council requested that additional information came back in relation to the art component, and we did a range of workshops, etc., to provide context and information before we proceeded, and then the rest of the information as that was completed actually was advised through the EMIB process and seeking if there was any additional information required before we executed the contracts. So that would be it. If council approve the budget, we assume that it's okay to go. But if there was an amendment to include a particular project that there was some more information, that's an option as well. And as you described, either take that out of the budget is one option, or amend it. But that would probably not be ideal, because then the project wouldn't necessarily be able to be completed. Yeah, and just to add, there's a asterisk that we can apply, which if you look at the bottom of the projects, which describes subject to further information. So,
okay, but just to follow on from that, we're not really talking about what ifs anymore. We're talking about a specific project and a specific provision in the budget. If council were minded to ask for more information and more workshopping of the project, how would we approach it from a budget perspective next week? Is your advice that we would take it out of the budget altogether and we'd provide for the necessary funds by way of a budget adjustment later on, or is there another way forward? CEO.
If I could, through the chair, I think the best answer is to put just request that an asterisk be put against that line item on the supplementary information, and also these projects will be subject to council consideration prior to commencing the works. So if you look on page 2 of the supplementary information at the bottom, you'll see a line there, and all it would entail would be that the council would ask that that particular project have an asterisk against it. That's it.
Okay, any other questions? Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for that information as well. Look, but there are two other black spot in the budget as well. I noticed because they're right next to Derby Road. That's for Hastbury Road, I think, and Salvado. Could we also have some information about them before the budget, so that we can, know what's actually sort of what we may be approving?
Director Technical Services.
Thank you for you, Presiding Member. So there has been a summary of, similar to Derby Road between Aberdare and Nicholson, which obviously we've been talking about for the last few minutes. In addition to the summary of consultation that's been undertaken for that, there's been a similar sort of summary of consultation that's been prepared and provided in the EMIB. I believe it was in March, but I can recirculate that, which has been done for the roundabout proposed for Derby and Heytesbury, and then I can provide some further information about the other black spot project this week as well.
Councillor White.
Thanks. Just two quick questions. Just coming back to the idea of the asterisks in the budget and council consideration. I mean, the budget is developed with a particular treatment or scope of works already in mind. But I imagine with the consideration that you mentioned, you're referring to with the use of the asterisks, that that's not necessarily set. There could be then budget adjustments made later should that be a decision made? Question mark. And the second question is just, could you tell me a bit about how black spot funding works? It was in the last budget, but obviously now rolled over. Do you get it after you've spent it? Is it able to be gotten later, as obviously has been proposed in this case? If you could just give us a little bit of detail on black spot funding. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, and for you, presiding member. I'll try and keep it pretty succinct, but I can always provide further information subsequent. So really, first off, it starts off with quite a thorough assessment process. So you can only nominate a location and a treatment type if it qualifies, and typically if it qualifies, it needs to meet a certain threshold. So typically that's a certain volume or number of accidents or accidents of a certain severity. So typically you work on almost a triage basis and try and address the worst locations in your precinct first. So that's the first process. It's typically applied for by officers about 12 to 18 months in advance. It is assessed by Main Roads and also independently by road safety auditors. So they look at both the proposed treatment type to see if it's suitable for what's the current crash patterns that are present there. If you're susceptible, Main Roads administers the funding. Typically just around about May each year, they'll notify of recommended projects for approval, and then it's obviously up to each council to accept it as relevant in the appropriate budget. As far as when the council receives funding for that, typically it's done in 3 installments. You'll receive a 40% installment up front to facilitate the project. You'll receive a second 40% payment once the project is practically complete. And then once you've financially acquitted, you'll get the final 20%. And that can be on one financial year or multiple financial years. It's really up to the complexity and the staging of the project. And just to clarify, depending on the type of project, gives a different contribution. So if it's a state black spot project, it's a 2/3, 1/3 arrangement, whereby the state provides 2/3 funding towards the project and the local government is to provide the remaining 1/3. In the other cases, if it's a federal, as is the case with the Derby, Aberdeen to Nicholson project, that's 100% federal funded. And that's typically the locations which have the highest number of accidents or the most severe accidents.
Any other questions on the budget? Councillor O'Connor.
Sorry, thank you, Mullen, and apologies that I didn't send this in earlier. There's a line there for laneway improvements and renewals. Is that specifically for particular locations? Do we know where those locations are?
Director of Development, Technical Services.
So probably what would be easiest for the benefit of elected members, I can provide a list of that and show the locations. But it is obviously based on need and for those locations that are most in need for resurfacing.
Any other questions on the budget? Councillor Kosovich.
Just a quick question while we've got the Director of Technical Services in full flight. A question that a number of residents have raised with me. I live in Olive Street and our road was just redone, and they've come up to me and said, well, there was nothing wrong with it. Why has it been done? And I felt myself falling back into the old line about, well, it's the end of the financial year but that wasn't where I went, and I was hoping you could clarify that for us tonight, and so that people out there who are genuinely concerned, and there are quite a few people, as to why we are resurfacing roads when apparently they're in good order. Thank you.
Thank you, and for you, Presiding Member. You're right, this is not an uncommon question. We do get it from time to time, and it's quite reasonable. So you're quite right. The way the city typically intervenes, and it's not dissimilar from most local governments, is ideally the best time to intervene from an asset management perspective is prior to the road failing or getting to the stage where it deteriorates more rapidly, which means it requires a more costly and also a more inconvenient and more time-intensive treatment. So what that means in practice is really prior to large cracks and other visible deformations appearing, which a layperson would see and say that road's in a bad condition, ideally you want to get and treat the road prior to that stage, because typically if you intervene by the time it looks so severely cracked or damaged, typically the underlying pavement has suffered unnecessary degradation, which means the life of it has been reduced, which, long story short, means that you will need to probably do a more extensive works for what's typically known as a road reconstruction sooner. What would typically be a 1 or 2 days work to resurface becomes a couple of weeks and significantly more expensive. So in a short way, it's the most economic and the least disruptive method to maintain our roads, and it's best practice.
Great answer, James. Thank you.
Last call for questions. Councillor Powell.
Yeah, look, just one question of clarification. It's about the asterisk. Whether an asterisk would require an amendment.
I'm certain it would. I mean, the answer is yes, but Director Corporate Service.
Thank you, through you, Presiding Member, and thank you for the question. The answer is yes.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on. Oh.
Sorry.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. With the black spot funding that you mentioned, so is it the case that we've already received part of the funding for Derby Street? That's my understanding. And if so, if it wasn't to go ahead with speed bumps, would that funding be able to be utilised either to another black spot project or for another type of, intervention on that street?
Director of Technical Services.
Thank you, and for you, Presiding Member. So, as I outlined, typically at the start of financial year, if a project is approved, you would typically claim the first 40% from main roads. If the project does not proceed, obviously you're obliged to repay that in full. Unless you get an approved variation to the project, which typically is fairly minor because everything has a benefit cost associated with it. So if you drastically change the project, the benefit cost could drastically change and may no longer qualify. So if you substantially change the project, typically that won't be approved, and that means you have to withdraw the project and provide all funding that's been received in relation to it back. And yeah, so just to, I guess, add further colour, obviously they're site specific, so it's on a per project basis. So if you decline one or return one, you can't just use it elsewhere in that financial year. You would basically have to separately apply. And that'd be in a future financial year and through a future process.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. And just, so if it was considered that we were, hypothetically, say we decided to go with the, not the cameras, but, the speed. Smiley face, thank you. If it was considered to, instead of have speed humps, to have it on the same location but with the smiley face, would that still comply for the funding?
So I guess there's two parts to that. So with a black spot, there's approved treatments as well. So these are treatments which have a wealth of science behind them that back that they will improve things. I don't believe those smiley face signs, I know the ones you're talking about. I don't believe they're even on the approved treatment list, first off, for a black spot project. And secondly, like I've said, if it's a significant departure, that would require approval, and if it's not approved, you'd have to hand back the money for that project.
Councillor Powell.
Just to make sure I understood correctly, though, we haven't yet spent that money, though. Is that right?
That's correct. I think we may have only spent a few grand for design, but that's about it. The majority of the project has not been spent, no.
I can't resist. Director Technical Services. How much is a few grand roughly? You don't get much for a few grand these days in the world of consulting services. Is it double figures?
If you give me a couple of minutes, I can run a report to give you the exact values. If you so choose.
Have you got the anchor?
Are there any other questions on the budget? Okay, we'll just wait for the answer on the question I asked, then we'll move on. Mr. Hambley.
So to date, aside from staff expenses, there's only been $261 spent to the budget, so very little. There's overhead, but that's typically taken out, so I'm not considering that as part of the project expenses. So not much at all.
Okay. Well, I think we can move on then. Are there any questions on C9, the financial statements and reports for the month ending 31 May 2024? I'm going to take that as a no. Great. Okay, well, that's the end of the open agenda items, and there will be at least one confidential item at next week's meeting, but for tonight's purposes, we're through the agenda. So I will call the agenda briefing forum of the 18th of June 2024 closed, and the time is 6:37 p.m. Thank you, councillors, and thank you, staff.